Hey folks, and welcome to another episode of the Creator Toolbox. This is the show all about the nuts and bolts behind your creator business. I'm Colin Gray from thepodcasthost.com, and this time around I'm joined by Matthew McLean. How are you getting on, Matthew?
Yeah, fine, Colin. Thanks for inviting me on. Didn't realise the show was struggling so much, but happy to help out.
Yeah, not at all. Matthew, so just a quick introduction for the Creator Toolbox audience. You have worked with me for, too many years now. What, 9 years?
Yeah, long time coming up
9
for
years.
my decade of service, haven't I?
Indeed.
Yeah, maybe
And
buy
you,
me a pint for that.
well, there's been a few pints over the years.
There has.
But Matthew, you are basically our audio expert, our audio guru, podcasting extraordinaire. You write like 2/3 of the blog posts for the podcast host as a blog. So much of our content that goes out there. And overall, what do you describe your role as? Is it content manager? What do you actually tell people when they say, what do you do?
Yeah, it's funny. I usually just say don't ask. Because I wear many hats and I struggle to succinctly define them, which is ironic given that is my job to do stuff like that. So yeah, I used to mainly be all about the audio editing, but got into the writing as well, doing gear reviews, doing tutorials, helping people with all sorts of aspects of podcasting. I have been doing it a long time, albeit not very well, but I try my best and I've learned a lot over the years. So just making sure that the content's going out regularly and trying to, keep us up there in the old Google machine.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, and helping everyone that does find us. Yeah, for sure. I mean, you're always humble about it, but you do know this stuff back to front. And the reason we've decided to do this episode is we're going to try a slightly different format. So if you're out there listening, you'll know that normally we talk about a range of different tools, tactics, mindsets, frameworks around creating content, around helping your creator business run more effectively, create more successful content. This time around, we're going to dig right into one project that Matthew and I, primarily Matthew to be fair, worked on over the past 2-3 months. And that was a full season of our podcast, which is called PodCraft. So PodCraft is another show that we run. It's primarily focused, like solely focused on podcasting, how to create a great podcast, how to grow an audience through audio like that. And we hit season 20 recently, didn't we, Matthew? I mean, that makes us feel old as well, I think.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, theoretically, we have done more because we've revisited seasons and re-recorded them when the topic demanded it. So we've probably done closer to 30, but season 20 officially. So
yeah, that's true, actually. That's something to talk about in a future one too. It's a question we get a lot around, particularly with podcasting. If you have a long-running podcast, how do you update old content, or whether you do? But anyway, we'll come back to that future episode. This time around, it's around hitting that milestone, that 20. We decided to do something special, something different. And will you tell us, Matthew, what did you decide? It was your idea, really, wasn't it? Like, what was your concept around this new season?
yeah, so there was a few things going on, wasn't there? I mean, obviously the number 20, it feels like you should maybe do something special. So we've talked extensively about pretty much every topic under the sun to do with podcasts, and I always do enjoy those conversations, and hopefully the folks that subscribe to the show do as well. But sometimes it's just nice to get out of your own bubble, isn't it? There's lots of fantastic podcasters out there, and it's a missed opportunity if you're not able to speak to them too and find out about their own experiences, because a lot of the times they'll be different from ours. They'll even lead to different perspectives and opinions than we've got as well, and I think that's good for the listener, not just to be in an echo chamber, isn't it, to get these variations of experiences. And
Yeah. So it was all about bringing in. Normally, just to be clear, normally our show is co-hosted like this, isn't it? It's just you and I talking on PodCraft about topics. We don't tend to do interviews. We don't tend to bring other people on very often. It has happened, but not very often at all. So the concept was, to go out and interview, 10, 12 people was it in total?
14 it was in total, yeah.
Nice.
Yeah, a couple of them being co-hosted shows, but 14 total guests.
Yeah, and then take those 14 and not just turn it into 14 episodes of a standard interview podcast, as in an interview with each of those people individually, but instead, a montage episode, Matthew? What does that mean?
Yeah, so instead of, like you're saying, Colin, a traditional podcast interview, the guest comes on, the guest of the week, we talk through everything that guest has to say, and then that's the end of the episode. Next week, join us for a new guest. And that's great. That's how a lot of podcasts work. But for a montage, there's slightly more curation and organization behind it. This time, we're going to ask the same or similar questions of multiple guests, in this case 14, and then we're going to group the answers into themed episodes so we can concentrate exclusively on monetization in one episode, and all the answers and all the content, the conversation will be around that topic. So it makes for a very good narrative over a whole season, rather than your narrative being contained in that one episode, I would say.
Yeah, I love these kind of episodes. Like, you find them, they're more kind of documentary style or something, aren't they? They're like highly edited, highly produced. You bring together even just 3-4 different people into one episode. Sometimes you hear it on other shows. You've done it with 14, which was mental. But I love and so to be clear, that's what we'll dig into. We'll dig into how you've done that this episode, so that other people can try and follow, at least in some way, like take some of these techniques, and you out there can create your own, maybe a few episodes together, or even just one. And I think this works for video just as well as it does for audio. So if you're a YouTuber out there, you're a podcaster, even a blogger in some ways, but particularly that online, like if you're creating a YouTube episode around, 3-4 different people, the tactics that I saw you do, Matthew, over the last couple of months around like bringing together these interviews, picking out the good bits, theming them, bringing together the parts that relate to each other, tying in a narrative, all that kind of stuff. It's all so interesting. So we're going to dig into that. And yeah, like I say, I think if anyone out there is listening, it's such a cool thing to try, for all sorts of reasons. I mean, just the fact that it's a collaboration, like the opportunity for collaborating with a few other people, I think is so interesting. Like those people that you interviewed for that show now have 6 or 7 episodes of our podcast that they were involved in, that makes them look really cool. It's really polished and brilliant. They're so much more likely to share that kind of content than they are a standard interview, I would suggest. So yeah, it's a great way to collaborate. People build those relationships, build something that they think is great, so that they're going to share, and they're kind of more, it just ties them together with yourself a little bit more, like gives you something to work with on them, as well as promotional material for the future. So yeah, I think it was a really cool idea. So where do we start with this, Matthew? Where do we jump in?
I guess I've just one more thing to add on that front, and that's that it's very easy to get sort of dry how-to advice these days, isn't it? Especially with the emergence of AI. Like, we can get instructions on anything, including how to podcast or how to create content. But I do like that angle of, here's how I did this. Here's what I did. Here's the struggles I faced. Here's how I overcame them. I think in almost all cases that could be more valuable for the consumer, for the listener. So I think that was a really important angle of this as well.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. So, let's take, we don't need to go too much into this, but how did you actually find them in the first place? Because I've found when we've looked at doing collaborative stuff in the past, it sounds like a great idea. People are often sold on it, but the first stumbling block is often finding people that, want to be involved. So many people are quite busy. So many people they've got their own stuff on. How did you actually find the people for this, and qualifying that by making sure that they're actually really valuable guests as well, because the people you got on were actually really legit high level podcasters, with proper creator business behind what they do?
That's right. Yeah, it was important to get the right caliber of people that were going to be interesting and helpful to our audience. One of the challenges I faced straight off was I don't have any social media, I don't have LinkedIn or anything like that. And I know that these days that's how a lot of podcasters maybe find guests, or they have maybe wee relationships, they notice people. And that does make it harder. But I also think that is kind of a good thing in that, and I found in past experiences that maybe somebody will have a social media persona that presents them as very successful and doing good stuff. And when you look below the surface at what they've actually created, they've not actually done that much. So, this was me coming in with completely fresh eyes and thinking, what podcasters out there have either been doing it a few years, or, they've been doing it a shorter time, but they've produced a lot of content consistently. they've been nominated for awards, maybe they've won awards. So that was my starting point, was to look at a lot of independent podcast awards, because straight away that's a verification, isn't it? You've straight away, they've had to meet certain criteria just to get there. So that was the starting point.
I loved that idea, actually. Like, I remember when you brought that up, like, just that was the first stop, like combing through some of these awards categories, because there's so many of these more independent awards as well, particularly when you don't go for maybe whether you're in podcast and blog and video, or even your niche, like looking for experts in your niche. Like, as soon as you go beyond the kind of maybe the top level award, there's all these other like community awards and stuff like that, where there's all these people you've never heard of, but actually turn out to be doing such cool stuff. So yeah, and we got some really interesting people through that as well, didn't we?
Yeah, I mean, there were a couple of them that we knew already. Andrea of the Mindful Marketing podcast, we knew Andrea, and she was a perfect example of somebody to come on and talk to us. And then another podcast, Gabe of the Board Game Design Lab, literally just a podcast that I'm an avid listener of. And, I reached out to him and was delighted when he agreed to come on, because, again, like so many of these folks, just an incredible example of just a person, just an independent person who got really, really into a topic and absolutely dominates it now. Like board game design, you Google that, Gabe is like, he's the guy everywhere. And he came from he just got a microphone and started interviewing people. So, just amazing examples of what's possible with podcasting, I think.
Yeah, it's so cool. So that's a great place to look in the first place. The other one that I hadn't even thought of, you brought up, was Riphonic, wasn't it? How did you use that tool?
Riphonic's great because, I mean, they've got a lot of cool tools, which I could talk about in a second. But first and foremost, when you're seeing a podcast being nominated for an award, you still don't know, how long has it been running? How many episodes does it have? And I know reviews aren't the be all end all, but when you see a show that's got 200 reviews, they're doing something right. So Riphonic, at a glance, you could just look up a podcast and it will just give you all that info. They do have paid tiers and stuff like that, but I've never subscribed to that. But just a really good way of quickly checking the health or status of a podcast, if that's the right term. And you're able to see, this person's been doing it a long time, or they've put out a lot of episodes, or they're obviously doing something right that 500 people have reviewed them 4 or 5 stars. So it's a good tool.
Yeah, I've used that a lot for just kind of general prospecting. Yeah, like just looking up, here's 5 to 10 podcasts that might be worth doing some kind of collab with, whether it's a co-hosted episode or an interview. Even actually, it's great for that interview type research too. You can get an estimate of the listeners. It's not the cheapest in the world, is it? If you want to actually use it long term. Yeah, and you can only go on.
I was just going to say, it's worth also just highlighting they've got a great 3D graphic tool where you can type in your own podcast, and it's like a big 3D spider web of like all the shows that have crossover audiences with yours. So I think that's brilliant. If you wanted to do maybe a co-hosted episode, maybe you wanted to do a trailer swap, maybe you're just looking for other guests in your space, you could see like what my audience really like these other shows. So there's a big crossover opportunity there. So I'm a big fan of Riphonics. I can't remember what it's called, like the 3D graph or something. It's called something more impressive than that.
Yeah, we'll put a link in the show notes for that. I'll make a note. But yeah, it's a way to, it's weird. You can rotate it and it's kind of all interconnected podcasts, isn't it? So it shows all the different links. It's really cool. But yeah, you can pay as well. I think it's maybe $50 a month, might even be more actually. It might even be $100 a month. It was enough that it wasn't really worth it for me, like just to use once a month or something like that, certainly. But for that, you get like estimated listener numbers and loads of other data that's actually pretty useful. So for some cases, like if you're doing a lot of interview outreach, really good tool. Right. So next, the next bit that often trips people up, though, is that kind of outreach, like actually reaching out to these people. One thing to say at the start was actually, I think looking for guests in this way through awards like this generally surfaces folk that probably have less higher profile, but are still just as legit in terms of their skills. So it's easier to reach out potentially because they're not quite as inundated. But did you find that? And like, how did you go about that? Like, what way did you use to get in touch with them?
Yeah, so I mean, first and foremost, you know what podcast you're going after, and you're hoping that they'll have a website. And fortunately, a lot of them did. I mean, I'll say, like, I did reach out to more people than we ended up getting on, so I didn't get everyone.
Yeah.
And obviously tried a few. Cheeky's the wrong word, but I approached a few high-profile podcasters just in case, because why not? But when you find their website, you're hoping that there's a contact page or a contact form or an email address, and fortunately, a lot of them did have that. Some didn't, so there's that. But just reaching out and making a very clear request, not being ambiguous. You know, we've all had the emails about, you know, I'm kind of thinking about doing this thing, and would you be interested? And, like, you know, we could figure it out. And I think people just want to know, like, okay, what do you want? What are you looking for? What do you want to do? What are the details? Yeah. So, I mean, Colin, you and I had, we'd already, and we wouldn't do this in a typical podcast interview, would we? But we'd sat down and worked through the questions we wanted to ask. There was maybe 12, 13 of them, wasn't there?
Yep. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, I think the questions were the biggest part of the planning, weren't they? That kind of starting to think about, like, what we've done a couple of these types of episodes before, and I think one of the things we found, wasn't it, that it's really hard if you just do a general interview the way you would normally do it. You have maybe 5 bullet point ideas of what you want to dig into, but you're going to follow your curiosity. And that does make for really good interviews if you're good at it. Like, if you do kind of follow that, you do dig into the detail, all that kind of stuff. But it's not exactly ideal for this type of episode, is it? So we tended to think out in detail what the questions would be. What did you kind of dig into on that? Like, how detailed did you go? Did you end up going off track a little bit and digging into some of the detail or not? Or did you try and stick really strictly to the structure?
Yeah, definitely off track. I mean, it's nice to approach this with the view of, you know, here are say 13 questions, and we'll get a nice succinct answer to all of these, and it'll all be neat, and we'll package it all up, and it'll be very consistent. But you're talking to other humans, and you know, as much as we're all podcasting, like, people had wildly different experiences. Some were, you know, really involved in one aspect. Some had just no experience at all in some of the other stuff, and so there's no point in flogging the horse there. And, you know, I really need more on monetization. Some of them, I'm not doing monetization, so that's kind of the end of that road. Whereas it turned out they were really heavily involved in another side. So, you have to put your human clothes on rather than your. You know, I'm just creating a robotic series answers here.
Yeah, I think it's really worthwhile though. It's almost thinking through what you want the episode to look like at the end of the day before you even create the questions, isn't it? Like, we have an idea of roughly 6 episodes we want to cover. Maybe it's growth, maybe it's monetization, maybe it's what gear did you use, that kind of stuff. So you know there's going to be 2 or 3 questions in each of those categories, and you know that the way we put something together like this is around, you know, we have a bit of narrative saying. So then we asked them all, like, how did you grow your podcast? And then we give 3 voices or something answering that one question. But then I guess from there, that's when you can kind of branch off into those more detailed ones, saying, oh yeah, but then Andrea surprised us with this answer. And you dig into that. So there's definitely something around, it's really worthwhile with that pre-plan, isn't it? Thinking through that structure so that it's so much easier to put it together at the end of the day, but still not robotically following it and missing out on those opportunities. But I suppose that's the same for any interview, isn't it?
Definitely. And then what happened sometimes was I'd ask the question, but I felt like there was a little more. So I would ask a follow-up question, which was ostensibly going off script. And either I'd get just a much better answer to the initial question, which we would substitute that in, or you would just get this new angle on something that would then lead to, you know, when I was building the final narrative, we could, you know, I could have you as the narrator come in and expand on it and then lead into this next, or maybe that just led to something that fitted nicely into another episode. So again, as much as you've got a plan, you need to, you know, when you're editing, you could go off script and you could move things around. And I think that's important. It's not trying to shoehorn everything into boxes.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, the biggest problem with doing a sort of general just scattergun interview and then try to turn it into something like this is trying to figure out the threads, isn't it? Like trying to theme stuff. Like looking through a 30-minute interview, it's 5, 6, 30-minute interviews and try to pick out, oh, here's 7 bits that are all kind of related I can bring into an episode. So that's why the structure really helps. But being able to ask those follow-up questions that really make them... We often find that in interviews, don't we? Like, you ask something and they almost restate themselves and say it so much better the second time round. It's funny that.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's a really good point, that. Okay, cool. So questions. Done. So we've got that all set out. You did were there any surprises actually in the recording side of things?
No, I wouldn't say so. No, I mean, I tried to make it easy for them. They had a Calendly link in the email. They could just book in without even replying to me to say they were up for it, and that was it set up. And there was a squad. I was recording it all on Squadcast at the time, so they got the link through, and it was all very straightforward. It just took a couple of months to do all the recordings. Again, was being in Scotland, and you've got a lot of folks, maybe America or that. There's a time zone thing, so I had to do a lot of them in the evening. But you're obviously trying to accommodate as best as you can just to get the stuff done. So I was happy with all that.
Perfect. Okay. Right. Should we just jump to the how you actually put it all together then? That was the kind of the tricky part. I think that's the part that would probably overwhelm most people, is how you actually take that then. 14 interviews. Yeah. And how long were they on average?
I would say I spoke to most folk for about an hour.
Really?
Including a bit of preamble, obviously.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of content there. And I had two thoughts in mind. So one of them was, let's go old school. We'll print all the transcripts. I'll get some nice highlighter pens, and we'll start to pick out quotes that way.
Yeah.
And then my other thought was, I'll tell ChatGPT that I'm Ira Glass and I'm making a podcast series, and I'll put all these transcripts in, and I'll just say, script this episode, pull out the best quote, give me a monetization episode. And I know that there's a lot more to AI than that. But it was shambolic. It was blatantly just making up quotes and stuff.
Really?
I know a lot of
transcripts.
To do with, like I thought that's a really good quote, but I don't remember that. And I looked and it just made it up. And then I said, you've literally made that quote up, and it went, oh, I'm really sorry. Like, I don't want your apology. I just want you to accurately transcribe give me a quote that exists. But I quickly binned both of those approaches and met somewhere in the middle, which I could, of course, talk about more if you would like.
Yeah, for sure. I feel like the area I remember, one of the projects I remember doing most sort of in depth on this was remember the Converge Challenge podcast we did a few years back, and I interviewed 4 or 5 different people in person, and then turned that into a montage type podcast just like this as well. And I found the hardest part was that theming, and it was part of the lessons from that certainly came forward into this, because I didn't plan it well enough in terms of that theming ahead of time. I think that's the kind of thing that ChatGPT or AI in general could help with a bit, in terms of, take this transcript and give me a chapter by chapter breakdown, time codes and all, give me an average, like a sort of general topics for each section. And it wouldn't, so that's what I think it's good at, like taking 5 transcripts like that and then just sort of breaking down topics, tagging, chapters, all that kind of stuff, different subjects. So that would be a start, at least, in chopping it up, I think. But I think you're absolutely right. Like, this kind of show depends so much on the tone, on the kind of the intent behind the content, so much more than just the words themselves. And you're hoping to get these really kind of inspirational parts that kind of ramp up and down in terms of mood and pace and all that kind of stuff. And that doesn't come through in the transcript, does it? So it feels like that's the part that you need to then go and do, having got at least the categorization done. Do you think?
Yeah. And transcripts are so messy. Like, some might sound like a great quote, but you see it written down, you think that just looks shambolic. So, transcripts, they do help, but you can't do it with that alone. And in the end, I mean, I used a big Adobe Audition session. I use Adobe Audition. I've always used it. And I just really started to big picture bundles of themed topics. So not in any particular order, here's stuff about monetization and loosely associated with it. Here's stuff about growth and then putting these big bundles together. and then taking that and creating a transcript for that rather than a transcript of one big conversation. And that's where I started to see, okay, I do see a thread here now. Also looking at the order, does the season, does that want to be storytelling in the sense of, let's start when you thought about podcasting, let's talk about your launch, let's talk about, your initial episodes. And I didn't really want to do that. I quite like, in a film or a book, you don't always see a very linear story. You maybe open at the end and get, a cliffhanger, and then you go back to the start. So I'm not saying it was as dramatic as that, but, we opened the season with, talk to us about when you nearly quit your podcast. So we were already, the listener was straight into it, and then we could dial it back and start at the start later on. So just trying to build a narrative.
Yeah. Let's dig into that a bit more, but I just getting geeky a bit. How did you actually organize it? Like you're working in Adobe Audition, Adobe Premiere is just exactly the same if people are working with video. You've got 14 different hour-long audio files. It would be the same for if you're bringing in 14 different video recordings for video interviews. What did you do to bring those files in and then start to organize them and break them up? Like, was it literally just going through and looking at when you spoke and cutting then, because that's when your questions are, and categorizing that way? Like, tell me a bit about that process.
Yeah, so there was a bit of that. So again, going back to this, we've got the overall season session file, which is a big mess. It's got a big block of like an hour's worth of clips on this subject, an hour's worth of clips on that subject. So once I'm confident that okay, I think these are the initial stones I'm going to carve each episode from.
Oh, but sorry to jump in. Like I'm talking about even before that. Like, how did you make those initial clips? Like, you've just got an hour-long podcast episode. How do you break it down into the parts you need and want? Like, did that take a long time too?
No, not really. Again, it was, sorry if I wasn't clear on that. It was mainly going off. I had my own side of the conversations in there as reference. So I knew what questions I was asking. And my questions weren't very long. So it wasn't like it was taking me a long time to listen to what I'd said. So based on the questions I'd asked, I was able to chop them up and group them and then transcribe that group.
So you're essentially doing a cut every time you see your side of the track, because you've got two different tracks, so you can see it really nicely visually, I'm guessing. Yeah. So that's a nice thing to think of if you're recording interviews like this. If you can record in two separate tracks, you can really easily see when the interviewer speaks and then the interviewee speaks. And therefore, actually, the cuts are so much easier. And then that question lets you, okay, cool. So that was just a quick little question there. Yeah,
it's essentially like chopping up a large sausage or block of wood, for lack of a better term. But like you've got your whole episode and you're making cuts. Each time I talk, I cut it, I see what's happening, and I throw it in the appropriate bucket. And there's 8 buckets, say.
Perfect. So folders in Audition or Premiere, you're taking that clip based on the question, put it into a folder. Oh, different sessions, right? Okay, yeah, perfect. All right, interesting, good stuff.
So we take the party to its own session, essentially.
Yes.
Once they're all bundled up, we say we've got the raw materials for an episode here, and then I'm a lot less cluttered once I could move that into its own session. But then there's the subcategorization, right?
Yeah.
Everything here is around monetization, but again, we start afresh. There's a narrative here. There's all sorts of different strategies and tips and questions being asked. So you're not starting again, but you're starting from, let's now get this in order. And some of the stuff ends up getting cut, of course, later on too.
Are you marking those clips in any way? Do you rename them every time based on the topic?
Yeah, so I had different channels for each of the podcasters, and I was using a variation of the marker tool in Audition. You just press M and there's a marker and you could label that. You could also label clips, you could recolor them, which is really useful for me. As you know, I'm heavily colorblind, but there's all sorts of ways you just start to map out the episode and make sure that at a glance you could see what's going on as well.
Yeah, that's cool. I can imagine in Premiere, the markers, I end up not using markers too much because often they end up on the track rather than the clip. And therefore, as soon as you move something, ripple delete or whatever, your marker goes out. I'm sure there's ways to use that better. So somebody out there might be able to tell me that. But I find it much easier the recoloring of the clips, really interesting. The labeling shows up really nicely in Premiere as well if you're working with this in video. But just the simple act of putting them all in folders that are the right one. You could even have subfolders as well for the subtopics. That sounds interesting too. And then working with the text as well. Are you using so I'm using in Premiere, I'm using the text option a lot. Like Premiere can automatically transcribe now. So you can really simply see exactly what's in a clip without having to listen through it. Are you using that in Audition at all yet?
No,
Does that exist?
no, not at all. I
Yeah.
couldn't even tell you, but I would say probably not. I could be wrong.
Yeah.
I usually am, but Audition, it doesn't get a lot of love these days. So
yeah. Cool. Okay. Right. Anything else on the content, the pre-production type stuff then? Yeah.
Just one more thing. So
Yeah.
obviously I wanted to literally edit through all of these clips. So I wouldn't usually do extensive edits like this, taking out ums and ahs and things like that. But I wanted to put the extra effort in here. It was a big production, a bit of a showcase for us as well. So to do that, a tool like Alitu, for example, has the playhead speed, so you could set that to double speed and listen through, like a lot of folks listen to podcasts anyway. Audition doesn't have that, so it's a slight quirk on that where I squash all the clips down to 50%, and then I could listen through them and edit them. I'm pretty fast at that these days. Again, I've been doing it a long time, and then once that's done, I could just pull it back out to 100%. So it's the same idea, it's just a different way of doing it, a bit more of a clunky way of doing it, but that meant that I was editing the clips properly and thoroughly. It's worth mentioning probably at this point the tool Edit Point as well, which is really handy. There's a wee app you get called Edit Point, and you can I think it's iOS, so if you've got an iPhone, you could use this. So you could have your audio clip, you could mix it down into Dropbox or whatever, and you could go out for a walk the dogs or that, and you could pull your provisional episode up on Edit Point, and you could listen back to it again. You could speed it up and listen at double speed, and it's got a nice little feature where you could add in markers. So I hear an edit point literally, and I can just press a wee button on my phone, and then when I come back to the computer later on, I could look at that file and it's got all these markers. You could label the markers, like there's short codes, so one might say glitch, or one might say cough or whatever. But you don't have to go that deep with it. But that's a great tool for taking editing away from your desk, and going and getting a wee bit of exercise too. So.
Yeah, I remember the first time you told me about that, I thought that was a great idea. I'm surprised there's not more of those out there to do that, because it's such an obvious thing, isn't it? Like, why do we sitting at your desk when you're doing that? Like, you listen to podcasts and they go anyway. So, okay, right. Production and publishing then. How did you so what was the process around finally putting these together? The actual narrative, and once you've got the edits, once you've got it all clipped out, how did it all come together from there?
Yeah, so your clips tell the story, and then it just needs a bit of narration to glue them together. So it was about knowing, at this point I knew the clips very well. Remember, I'm only working on one episode at a time here, so I'm not overwhelmed by it. So I start to know the narrative quite well. I know what everyone's saying, and then I'm able just to write a wee script for you, Colin, and send it over to you. And obviously, I'm writing these word for word, but you're able to edit them into your own words in certain cases, or go off script or that. But at least you know roughly what I'm saying. And then once you'd recorded that, you fired it back to me, and it was that was all the spoken word content. I could talk about music if you want, but was there any more on that kind of narrative side?
Yeah, the narrative bit's interesting as well, isn't it? Because it's you kind of feel like that is a really time-consuming, difficult thing to do in some ways. I remember, again, on that Converge Challenge one, that was one of the early ones I did in that kind of format. I found it initially quite tricky to write those little links. Like, it felt like, oh, this is going to take me ages to write little links between everything. But I remember within 2-3 episodes, actually, it became really simple, because you've got the content in the clips for the interviewees. You know what's coming up. You can even look at the transcript just to refresh yourself. And because of that, it's such a heavy prompt to write a decent little intro or an outro for a clip, like you say. That was, so you write something like, there's a really interesting point, and you're like, oh, such a good point there. I really loved how she said this and that. And now let's hear from Blah, who jumps into how they produced their episodes. And it's actually like, you can almost just talk it. Like, you can almost just ad lib it as you go, in a way. But obviously you were, like you say, you were writing a script for me to record, but it felt like I remember when I was writing it, that's what it felt like. It almost was just flowing straight out after having read the previous clip, and then read the start of the second clip, and it just kind of flows. It's easy to do. Did you find that, or do you find those kind of time consuming?
No, I found the scripting pretty easy. I think the work was done by that point, and it's you're on the home straight, I think. And like you're saying, the clips do the talking quite literally. So
yeah, I think this is one underused way to add like 5 times as much polish to a podcast. Like, how much better does a show sound if you've got a 30-minute interview and you just take an extra, I could be underestimating this, tell me if you think I am, but even you just take an extra hour to pick out maybe 2 highlights where you do a cut and you write just a little 30-second narrative voiceover for you, to just the way we did it on this one. And so you're only having to do it for 1 or 2 places in the whole episode, but it just makes, I think it adds so much polish to an episode if you do that, especially if, and we'll talk about it in a second, especially if you bring in music like you did as well. Like, you've got the interview, music ramps up, you do a bit of a voiceover, really highlighting something, then back into the interview again. I think that you can do a couple of those in an episode in only an hour, I would suggest. And it's such a polish adder. Do you think that's kind of reasonable?
Yeah. I mean, I definitely, not much more to add on that, but it certainly sets your show apart from, again, nothing remotely wrong with doing a normal interview, a quote unquote normal.
Absolutely.
But any extras you could do.
Yeah. And I would definitely say that's a later stage thing. Like, you don't want to be adding something like this in the early days of your interview. Just keep it simple until you've kind of got your main workflow, your main skills, your main everything that you normally do for an interview nailed. And then you start adding these bits of polish. And that's what takes it from, a good podcast to a great podcast. I always love the example around, do you listen to, I've asked this before, Matthew, do you listen to How I Built This by Guy Raz?
No.
It's such a good show partly because he's such a good interviewer. So he's honed the craft in a basic level, just how to do a great interview. But they do exactly this. They take maybe only 2 or 3 highlights per episode and do little narrative links and a bit of music. And it probably takes them longer because they're a whole professional team doing it like perfectly. But for an average podcaster, you could probably simulate that, I think, in a couple of hours at the most, if not even an hour. So worth thinking about, at least as a bit of polish. Right. Music. How did you use music in this?
Yeah, so the logistical side, it was we've got an Epidemic subscription, so they're a good music service, royalty-free music. And I've got a bit of a head start on this side of it because I've worked with audio drama and fiction podcasts for years, so that involves a lot of layering in music and working with music and how it kind of fits with the dialogue. But that's not to say that this is a impossible task for somebody to learn. I think, if you listen to shows that, like the show you've mentioned there, Colin, and some other more highly produced shows, you probably have a bit of an ear for this already. And even when you watch TV or film, you subconsciously you kind of know how music works with dialogue and that. So I think most folk at least have an ear for this sort of thing. And then it's just about picking a few tracks, picking 5 or 6 tracks, and just starting to move them around, seeing what might fit in there, and not overthinking it as well. I think sometimes you could get very into the weeds with this, but I found that once I had the track laid out for the first episode, I could just pull, say there was 6 or 7 different audio tracks in there. I could copy that into my next episode, and it wouldn't need moved around that much to just make it fit with that. So really, the first episode was where all the work was, and after that, it was just a case of moving it around a little bit.
Yeah, cool. I think there's a template that I've described to people we've worked with on creating podcasts in the past that is potentially a bit dumb, but it seems to resonate with folk, and it's the idea of a really long camel. And I think it's a way of thinking about this. It's the idea that you have an interview and you have a point where you want to put in a voiceover or highlight something, and you chop it at the point you want to cut it. So you spread it out. You've got a gap between the interviewee's last word and their first word again. And what you do is you create music in the shape of a double-humped camel, but very long. So there's like a rise up of the music at the start. As the interviewee's voice fades out, the music rises up. It plays for a second or two and then drops down, but to maybe 50% volume. And then my narrative comes in, or your whatever narrative comes in, and you speak for 20 seconds. the music is just in the background at 50% potentially, even less, and then it humps up again. So it's the second hump of the camel. It's a two-humped camel, just to be clear here. And then it goes up for about 2 seconds, and then it fades out to zero again. So you have these two humps on either end, and then the gap in the middle, which is down at maybe 20, 30, 50%. And that's where the narrative goes. And just that template, you can repeat it every single time. Actually works quite nicely for that. It puts in a load of polish, it sounds really nice, and it's just replicable across the whole episode as well. So there you go. Really long double humped camel. That's what you need.
Yeah, get the hump. That's how to do it.
Nice. Okay, cool. So that's music. The publishing and stuff, all probably pretty academic, isn't it? We publish to Alitu, as we always do, our hosting platform. We use transcripts to start creating stuff. Actually, that's worth digging into. Like, what did you do with the transcripts to create the blog posts? Because you did use a wee bit of help on that, didn't you?
Yeah, so again, transcribing the final episode, and because it was all edited at this point, it was a much cleaner transcript, and it was much easier to pick out. I wanted blog posts for each episode with the player in there, but I wanted to highlight all of the podcasters involved, and I wanted a nice quote from each of them from the episode too. So like I'm saying, the transcript made that easy at this stage. Everything's edited up. Still needs a wee bit of editing, to put it into proper written form. But that was easy to create those blog posts around. And of course, when you're sharing a podcast episode with people and you want them to share it, it's much better to be giving them a blog post on your own site than saying, can you share this with your listeners? It's on Spotify, Apple, whatever. They're much more likely to share a nice, visually appealing blog post with a good URL, aren't they?
Yeah, and actually some resources in it, like the follow-up stuff, the resources mentioned, here's some tips, here's a wee summary. Absolutely. Yeah, for sure. We have, for our seasons in the past, I think for this one you create an individual post for each episode. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So every episode, but then an overall post as well for the season.
Yeah, because that's what we've often done in the past, is for each of our seasons, our episodes don't necessarily justify a whole blog post by themselves, but we'll have a season post, which is around a topic, because our seasons tend to be around one particular topic. So let's say it's how to create a podcast website, and we cover that over 10 episodes. We've got one post, which is how to create a podcast website, and then it's 10 episodes actually listed in there, all the players. So that's what we've often done for our seasons. But this time around, it was really worthwhile having a separate blog post for everyone. But you still created that season post as well, so that you could direct people to, here's our whole season covering, all of these topics with these different podcasters. And it's a really good home base for the whole thing, wasn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
All right. I mean, yeah, that's so many good things in there. I think I hope that's been useful to folk listening to maybe think about doing something similar. You definitely you don't need to jump in with 14 people, do you, Matthew? You can do something like this with a lot less.
Yeah, definitely. Aye, for sure.
I think, even 3 or 4 people. I think even like 2 or even a couple of people. Like if you interview 2 people and then mix together 2 different interviews into one episode, even with 1 or 2 narrations from you, that's a much easier thing to handle to begin with, and just sounds so different from your average interview, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you can build on that. If you did end up wanting to do 20 people, you would know your workflow by then, so it would make sense.
You at least have tried it out, yeah, for sure. All right, perfect. Right, that was great, Matthew. Thank you very much. Great to walk through that, and great work on that season as well. I think it was such a useful thing for not only podcasters but content creators in general, actually. So if you're out there listening, you're a listener of the Creator Toolbox, you want to hear monetization strategies, growth strategies, how these 14 people basically run a business around creating content, not just focused around their podcast. They talk about other stuff too. Then definitely pop over there. You can find it. It's called PodCraft. That's PodCraft, CRAFT, PodCraft in any podcast listening app. And you'll be able to listen to that season, that whole season. All right.
Yeah, there's a link for the season that's maybe worth shouting out. thepodcasthost.com/podcraft20. And I've made the cardinal sin there of putting a number in a short link, because now people don't know if it's the number or if it's spelled out. It's the number, it's 20.
That's thepodcasthost.com/podcraft. I'm not making it any clearer here. PodCraft20, PodCraft20. Excellent. All right. Thank you again for listening. Do you know what? I would love to get your feedback on this, and I've put together a new way to do it. So if you're out there listening and you want to get in touch with us, either with feedback or with questions, or to suggest something for us to cover on this show in future, or guests to bring on as well. You know that we often bring on a guest and talk through their creator toolbox, whether that's gear, gadgets, mindsets, frameworks, tool sets, whatever it is. If you have someone to suggest, please do go over and join our community space. So that's the new place to gather around this show. So we've got a place called, we've got a community called IndiePod, and in there I've created a space just for the Creator Toolbox. So if you're a fan of this show, if you're enjoying what we're doing, you want to give us feedback, ask questions, whatever it is, go over to thepodcasthost.com/creator. That's thepodcasthost.com/creator. And that'll take you right to our space in the IndiePod community. That's where we talk about everything Creator Toolbox. We'd love to see you there. All right. Thanks again, Matthew. That was good fun. You off to do what you have to do now? You got any big plans for the rest of the day?
Get drunk. No, it's only 10:30. I've got at least another half an hour before I could do that.
I mean, it is Friday, so end of the week.
Yeah. Well, that's permission officially recorded. I've got a wee to-do list to work through today before I pick the kiddo up from nursery. So we'll get a wee play at the park this afternoon, I think.
Good stuff. Sounds good. All right. Thank you out there for listening too. Hope you enjoyed this episode. We'll see you on a future one. I'll talk to you then.